Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is a deep dive into something that might sound incredibly dry on the surface,
Yeah.
a localization plan for professional financial software.
Right. We're looking specifically at the Italian market at IT.
And if you're thinking this is just about swapping print for stampa, you couldn't be more wrong.
Not even close. We've got this whole stack of documents here from developers, from compliance experts, and they all prove one thing. In high-stakes finance, localization is not a linguistic project.
It's a mandatory legal and fiscal overhaul.
Right.
I mean, the goal here isn't translation, it's achieving compliance.
Exactly.
If you get the chart of accounts wrong or miss one tiny detail on the electronic invoicing, that software is legally unusable for any real business in Italy.
It is. For the developers of this kind of accounting software, this is the single most crucial step. It's the gatekeeper to the entire market. I mean, the sources we have treat this less like a language file and more like a technical blueprint for staying out of trouble with the Italian tax authority.
Okay, let's unpack this. We should start with the technical foundation. This is where the non-negotiable rules for the developers live, where human language really butts heads with computer code.
The first layer is pretty straightforward, but it's absolutely vital. It's character encoding.
All right.
Italian is fully supported by Unicode, so you don't get those issues with accented characters showing up as, garbage symbols. But the software demands some very strict internal communication that goes way beyond that.
And this is where we see those immediate do not touch warnings, things that are essential for data integrity.
Yes, right at the top of the master language file, at label ID 10000. It doesn't just list the ISO code, it has this explicit instruction in all caps. Do not translate. To customize this language file, create a copy.
Why is that so critical?
Well, that instruction is basically the system protecting its own integrity. If a local user or some amateur translator starts messing with that master file, they could destabilize the entire update process for the software.
So it forces them to work on a safe copy.
Exactly. It's the software saying, hey, respect the source code structure.
And speaking of structure, this project demands preserving these non-linguistic elements that are just vital for the software to function, even if they look like clutter to a user.
Oh, definitely. We're talking about everything from keyboard shortcuts to what we call dynamic placeholders. Take the ampersand, the affin symbol.
Oh.
If you translate the menu item file, but you forget to include that ampersand in the Italian translation, you break the keyboard shortcut. The user can't hit Alt+F anymore to open the menu.
So the ampersand has to stay. It becomes, say, an archivio.
It has to. The ampersand is basically a hidden signal flag for the operating system that has to survive translation.
And it gets even more sensitive with those dynamic placeholders you mentioned.
It does. Things like the software name tag. It looks like less than at APNAME. At greater than that, dynamically inserts the application's name, say TurboCASH H. You can't translate that.
If I did. If I translated that placeholder, the program would just display my translated phrase instead of the actual app name.
It wouldn't just display the phrase, it would break the entire function. The program is looking for that specific string to know where to inject the variable.
I see.
Same thing applies to the standard programming placeholder, %. That's used for inserting variables like numbers or dates. You change it, the software is blind to the data it needs to display.
That sounds like a recipe for some catastrophic data errors. We also see similar warnings around these tiny but mighty technical delimiters. The source material really emphasizes that the pipe character, the vertical bar, must be retained in file filter strings.
Yes, like in filter.flt.flt.
What does that pipe character do?
That little character is the operating system's internal separator. It's what it uses to define file types in a dialog box. You remove it, the OS doesn't know how to parse the string, and the file selection dialog just breaks.
So it's the invisible semicolon of the user interface.
That's a great way to put it. And we see this same strict rule applied globally, too, especially for banking identifiers, the ones that link this localized Italian system to the global financial network.
You're talking about SWIFT, BIC, and IBAN.
Exactly. They are all specifically flagged as terms that must not be translated.
Why the rigid rule there?
Because they're technical standards for routing money worldwide. They function as identifiers, not as descriptive words. SWIFT, BIC, which is often just the 8 or 11 character SWIFT code, and especially IBAN, the international bank account number, they're all codified systems.
And IBAN is just so incredibly crucial in the European context.
It's the single most crucial piece of data for European payments. The IBAN is often the only identifier you need for cross-border SEPA transactions. Translating that term into Italian would just create confusion, but more importantly, it would make the data structure unrecognizable to international partners.
So you keep the English acronym because it signals an international standard.
You have to.
That's a great segue. Because once we move past the code structure and global standards, we run straight into the regulatory jungle. This is where compliance becomes mandatory, and the system needs a total overhaul to meet Italian financial law.
And we have to start with the backbone of any accounting system, the chart of accounts, the COA.
You can't just use a generic international one.
No way. In Italy, the COA must be modified to align with one of two very rigorous standards.
And what are those standards? How do they impact the software itself?
They align either with the Italian civil code requirements, which are defined by the OIC, that's the Organismo Italiano di Contabilità, or with the structure needed if a company reports under the EU-adopted IFRS standards.
So the user has to pick a reporting pathway.
Absolutely. And that choice has huge structural implications. The COA has to define a mandatory set of core accounts required by law, and the database has to enforce the correct account numbering, especially the digit length.
So if the COA structure doesn't match the OIC's rules?
Then the financial statements the software generates are non-compliant. You can't use them for statutory filing. It's that simple.
Wow, that's intense. The developer isn't just localizing text, they're literally hard-coding national financial law into the database.
That is precisely the mission. And then you move to tax terminology, which is just as non-negotiable. You mentioned it earlier. You can't just call it VAT. You have to use the official term, IVA.
Right, IVA, Imposta sul Valore Aggiunto. But is it enough to just have this standard rate?
No, the setup has to allow for all the current correct rates. So, 4%, 10%, 22%, but also, and this is critical, specific codes for exempt or non-taxable transactions. The software must let the user define and apply all of those codes.
Okay, and speaking of transactions, let's talk about identification numbers. They're required for every customer and supplier.
That's the Codis Fiscale, the mandatory tax ID, and the Partita IVA, which is the VAT registration number. These are mandatory inputs. But here's the software implication. The localization sources highlight that the lookup feature for these is critical.
The lookup. Why is that so important? Isn't that just a convenience?
It's for data validation. Many databases in Italy cross-reference these numbers with addresses and legal entity data. So if the software can look up and validate that ID against a known database, it drastically reduces data entry errors.
It's a preemptive compliance strategy.
You got it.
Okay, now we get to the mechanisms that are really unique to the Italian tax system. Things that force specific calculations inside the software. Let's talk about ritenuta da conto.
That translates to withholding tax, and it's a critical piece of the puzzle. This applies to payments made to self-employed professionals, lawyers, consultants, you name it.
Right.
When a company pays one of these professionals, it is legally obligated to calculate a percentage, usually 20%, and withhold that amount.
So the system has to calculate that 20% on the spot, pay the remaining 80% to the supplier, and then the company has to remit the withheld 20% directly to the state.
Precisely. The software needs dedicated fields, specific transaction types, and crucially, the ability to automatically generate the remittance forms needed to pay that withheld amount to the state. If the software can't do that, it's failing its primary compliance duty.
That's a complex automated function demanded by law. And the other big one is reverse charge.
Or inversion contabili.
Hmm?
Yeah, that's where the VAT liability shifts from the seller to the buyer. It's used in specific B2B services within the EU or in certain sectors like construction. The software has to recognize these transactions and correctly record the VAT liability on both sides of the ledger.
Which brings us squarely to the highest stakes digital requirement, the one that governs how all these documents are exchanged. Electronic invoicing or fatturazione elettronica.
This is maybe the most infamous compliance hurdle. Italy was one of the first to make e-invoicing mandatory for most B2B and B2C transactions, so paper and PDF invoices are basically obsolete.
But this isn't just about emailing a file, is it? We're talking about two mandatory technical steps.
You're right. Step 1. The invoice has to be generated in a highly structured, specific XML format. It's not a visual document. It's pure data. You miss one tag, one sequence, the entire file is rejected.
And step 2.
That perfect XML file must be sent to the government's official exchange system, the Sistema di Interscambio, the SDI.
So the SDI is like the official air traffic control tower for every invoice in Italy.
That's a perfect analogy. Your XML plane has to follow the flight plan perfectly. The SDI verifies the invoice, stamps it, and routes it to the correct recipient. If your software can't talk to the SDI, it cannot legally issue an invoice.
So how does the SDI know where to send that XML file once it gets it?
It relies on recipient identification codes. The company issuing the invoice has to capture either the client's 7-digit codice destinatario, their recipient code, or their certified email address, the PEC. Without one of those two, the SDI can't route the document.
What stands out to me is the granularity required even for transactions that don't have tax. You can't just mark something as exempt in the XML.
Absolutely not. The XML standard is so rigid that for non-taxable transactions, you have to use specific NATRA IVA codes. For instance, the source note's N3.1 is for exports, N4 is for exemptions. You have to use the code to explain why there's no IVA on that line.
That moves us away from just coding a transaction value and into categorizing the legal reason behind it. It's fascinating.
It connects the invoice directly to the underlying tax rationale. It gives the government full, categorized oversight of all transactions.
Okay, let's move to Section 4. This is the layer of language precision. Once we've met the technical and regulatory hurdles, we have to ensure consistency in the language of accounting itself.
Consistency is king in professional accounting. You see it right away with trading partners. The English software might use the traditional terms debtor and creditor.
But the Italian localization prefers business-centric terms. So debtor becomes cliente, customer, and creditor becomes fornitor, supplier.
Correct. And they explicitly chose fornitor over the literal translation creditor in the menus to avoid ambiguity. In an operational menu, fornitor is just much clearer.
This applies to fundamental bookkeeping concepts too, I see.
Yes. The generic English term journal or batch, which could easily be confused with lottie, used in inventory, is standardized to the formal accounting term journal, or even more precisely, prima nota.
And debit and credit.
Standardized to the formal Italian terms. Debit is dare, and credit is avere. There is no room for colloquial interpretation here. The goal is to make the software instantly recognizable to an Italian accountant.
How does that apply to tracking late payments? We talk about age analysis in English.
The translation uses the professional technical term anzianità, specifically anzianità clienti fornitori. It denotes the aging of receivables and payables. It's concise, industry recognized, a professional tool.
And key document types are also standardized using their local acronyms.
That's vital. The delivery note, for instance, is translated as the standard Italian acronym DDT, which stands for Documento di Trasporto. Using DDT is essential. It has legal weight.
So these choices are so much more than translation. They're about embedding local business processes and legal recognition into the software's language.
Absolutely. It ensures the software speaks the language of the accounting profession, not just the language of the country.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, data integrity and these high-stakes warnings. Because if you're dealing with mandatory compliance, the system's internal messages have to be crystal clear.
The translation source shows a clear priority for clarity and impact, especially before irreversible actions. These warnings are designed to make you stop and think about the legal consequences.
Give us an example of a big one.
Okay, before a major structural change, one warning reads, Attenzione, questo influenzerà seriamente il tuo asset di libri contabili. Vuoi comunque continuare.
Attention, this will seriously affect your set of books. That is a very serious tone.
It is. And the strongest one is even more direct. Questa operazione altererà radicalmente I tuoi dati. Si raccomanda di interrompere e creare un backup.
This will radically alter your data. We recommend that you stop and make a backup. These are the messages that prevent a user from accidentally destroying their legally mandated financial history.
And they also cover structural errors, like the essential block. Impossibile eliminare un conto di controllo? You cannot delete a control account.
And we can't forget the system limitations for unregistered users, which have to be clear too. I see here it's strictly limited to 500 transactions or documents.
Yes, and at every facet, from warnings to core functions, the language must be consistent. Backup becomes salvataggio, restores ripristino, and the crucial data integrity check is a verifica. It's all about ensuring the user knows exactly what legal record they're handling.
So what we've seen today is this incredible deep dive into 3 complex layers. First, preserving the technical code. Second, navigating mandatory tax law like IVA and retenuta de conto. And third, that's strict compliance with XML electronic invoicing through the SDI.
It really confirms that financial software localization is, at the end of the day, a compliance discipline. And it raises a powerful question about the future, I think. If we look at the complexity required for e-invoicing today, these highly structured digital formats the governments demand.
You have to wonder what's next.
Exactly. Will governments eventually require all corporate financial data, the general ledger itself, to be transmitted to them in real time?
If that trend continues, this level of detailed localization and system integration won't just be an advantage. It will become the fundamental gatekeeper for doing international business entirely. If you can't integrate, you can't operate.
Indeed. Get it right or don't operate at all.
A fascinating and crucial deep dive. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.